People are going to continue coming in. Can you all hear me? Yes. Please stay muted, or I'll ask Phil to make sure that everybody is muted except for the person who is speaking. So we have no more phone calls. I had one as well. Excuse that. So I am delighted to see all of you here. This is a great tribute and well-deserved to Robert Jones, whom I've never thought of as Junior, but just Robert Jones. I first want to thank our supporters in the Common Reader, the 1619 project. That includes President Michelle Anderson, who is here tonight, the Office of Diversity and Equity and the We Stand Against Hate project, the History Department, and my co-host Philip Napoli, without whom nothing. My comrades in the 1619 project, including Gunja Sengupta, who is here tonight from the Department of History, and Martha Nadell, and Rosamond King, the Wolf Institute, the English Department, and I've probably left someone out, but you have all been wonderful. And of course, as well, Wazamuta, who is here, thank goodness, about whom I will say something in a minute, but who was herself a writer and contributor to the 1619 project of the New York Times. So I am thrilled that Robert is here amongst so many members of the Brooklyn College community, students, faculty, administrators, staff, friends, and relations. This is, as I said before, a wonderful tribute to a wonderful man and to his having written a wonderful novel, which is a beautiful object in itself. And in fact, reminds me these wonderful images or profiles of the waves of the 1619 project. I just want to say a very tiny thing about the novel because Wadza is going to introduce it. And that is that one of the things we talk about in MFA classes is the subject of interiority, how to convey a mind. And Robert has done such a magnificent job of conveying not merely the bodies of enslaved people, but their minds through those techniques that we talk about in either craft classes or my course on time, as it happens, in the creative writing program, through what's called free and direct discourse, in which a magical resonance occurs between the narrator's words and the register of a character's speech or thought. And that happens so beautifully in the character of Maggie, the cook of the family, the masters of the plantation empty. So that's all I want to say, because I don't want to steal Waza's thunder, not Wadza, thunder. And so I am going to turn this over to Wadza, who was my student in my time class last year, and also my Ulysses class in the fall. And as I said, is a member of the 1619 staff and an employee of the New York Times, which is the organization that supported and published the 1619 project. So without further ado, Wadza Muta.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to do a short introduction of Robert Jones, and it's nice to meet you. So Robert Jones was born and raised in New York and attended Brooklyn College, where in undergrad he studied creative writing and Africana studies. He also received his MFA in creative writing from Brooklyn College. Jones created the social justice social media community, Son of Baldwin, which engages in conversations and critical analysis from Black queer perspectives. Jones' writing has been compared to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, but he has forged his own path and voice. The Prophets is a New York Times bestseller, and it's not hard to see why. Every line is lyrical, every breath is magical, and the imagined transports us. In reading this book, I had to take breaks in between to marinate on the story and the lives of the enslaved people on a cotton plantation in antebellum, Mississippi. The prophets of the title are the voices of 7 ancestors communicating from the darkness. This is a love story, and it centers Isaiah and Samuel and their life at a plantation they call empty. When another enslaved man, Amos, begins to teach the Christian gospel in order to receive favor from Paul, their master, the other slaves who had been mostly accepting of Isaiah and Samuel's love turn against them. This is a story about love as a form of resistance. Jones researched pre-colonial African societies and discovered that gender and sexuality were not named, even though they existed. And he explores this in his novel by going back in time to an African village called Kasongo, from where Samuel and Isaiah are descended and where gender was fluid. And as I said before, this is a book that you cannot read in one sitting. And when you finish it, it will follow you and your thoughts will return to the characters time and time again. And to end this, I'll quote Danez Smith, whose words appear in the New York Times Book Review. Through these characters and their stories, the Prophets calls across time on queer warriors, women kings, root women, and boys in love to paint a long queer Black history, a history of rising against, of ever making one's way back to freedom. And with that, I just want to welcome Robert Jones Jr.
Thank you, Wadza. That was such a beautiful intro, and I am humbled by it. Before I begin reading, I would like to just say a couple of words. I'm overwhelmed by everyone who's shown up. Many of the people in this Zoom call are people who have shaped my creative thinking, my academic and scholarly life. There are many people in this room whose work has had some form of impact on me. And I would like to say thank you to Professor George Cunningham, Professor Ronnie Natov, Professor Wendy Ferry, Professor Ellen Tremper, Professor Joshua Henkin. There's just so many, like Brooklyn College has had such a tremendous impact on me. This book would not have been written if not for Stacy DeRasmo's fiction tutorial course, in which she charged us with going into the world and finding objects that a character that we were thinking about would possess. And I happened upon a pair of shackles in the garbage in the streets of Brooklyn and knew that that was immediately Samuel telling me that he would like me to tell his story. So thank you. I am forever indebted to Brooklyn College and its impact on me as not just a Black queer person, but as a Black queer artist. My gratitude. I will be reading from a chapter called Babel. And in Babel, Samuel and Isaiah are facing a sort of torture because they were lied upon. There was another character who said that they did something that they did not do. And as a result, they are being punished. And this is a pretty gruesome chapter, but in writing it, I tried to imbue it with as much beautiful language and landscape as I possibly could so as to balance the horror with beauty. At dawn, The trees of empty were as ferocious as they were during the shade of night. Looming and towering, stationed at the borders, beckoning high above the fog, but only in interest of luring close enough to kill. Kill whom? It depends. But lately, one kind in particular. These trees are no home, not to the sparrow or the blue jay, nor to the ant or caterpillar. These trees, some upright, some gnarled, some felled, all sentinels, tasked with one bit of labor, to witness. And maybe they do, but what use is a witness who would never offer up any testimony? But oh yes, the testimony is there, to be pried from them only. The streaks on their bodies, the gashes revealing the white meat beneath, the cracked branches snapped, holding the weight. There are reasons for every split, but they never tell, not even when asked. You must know, therefore, how to prod, where to seek, peering into the cuts that lead to roots, roots that lead to soil, soil that doesn't lie but curls beneath the toes of those whose blood nourishes it, who, in other lands, was skin family, just like the cosmos above. One day, someone will tell this story, but never today. These trees, they guarded the edges. The most crucifying places were at the edges, there where the plantation met the land that had no owners. So said the people who were killed for challenging the idea that dirt can have an owner. These were the roads, hot from the Mississippi sun, not dry because the air was too thick, where even horses walked more freely than people, insects hovering in the sovereignty they took wholly for granted, and the outer woods, the rivers rushing forward to who knows where, the arc of skies, low but forever out of reach. All of these things never to be touched by any of them without great cost, a loss of limbs or separation of spirit from body, the latter being the most preferable, but cowards would never understand that because liberty is more bitter than sweet. And what of the homeless birds? They fly over in judgment. Almost all of them, the sparrow and the blue jay, and also the dove and the robin, but the raven is nowhere to be found. And the crashing of their voices would singe if the ones at whom they were cackling weren't already burned by summer. So for the incinerated, the robin in particular was only music. And there was, too, another rhythm beneath, a quiet pulse, one that had started even before the march out to the ends of empty. Isaiah and Samuel thought they were the only ones who could hear it. Blithely, it whistled not so much in the wind as in the swaying of hands and hips, like in midday praise in the clearing where they weren't welcome unless. But the sound traveled and reached some ears whether they wanted to hear it or not. It wasn't, in fact, the people singing as they had first thought. It was someone else, or more than someone, judging from the harmonies. It sounded like something old and comforting, which made Samuel feel silly and Isaiah act it. Ruth had to say but one word, and James, who had to act even if he didn't believe, rounded up his barely men to shake Isaiah and Samuel out of slumber, even before the two of them had a chance to rise and shine into each other's faces, sweep up the hay they had fashioned into a bed, and greet the morning with the same trepidation they would for the rest of their lives. How quickly and forcefully they snatched Samuel and Isaiah up and ordered them to stand, and the gleeful yet rough-hewn manner with which they fastened the shackles to their wrists and ankles, and then the spikes. By the time they had pushed out of the barn, the animals more surprised than they were, horses flexing their front legs and pigs' squeals drawn out. Isaiah and Samuel had seen what the fog couldn't hide. They expected the crowd that had already gathered, golden in the torchlight of dawn. Some were tired, some were smiling. The latter stunned Isaiah, but not Samuel. These were people, after all. There was, therefore, some kind of happiness to be found in someone else being humiliated for once. Failure of memory prevented the empathy that should have been natural. Samuel knew, though, that it was selective memory, the kind that was cultivated here among the forget-me-nots. The morning mist would soon give way. It would no longer crown the heads and obstruct beauty from view. Soon, it would descend and bless their knees and then their ankles before disappearing into the ground itself, revealing then how even a horrible place like this could be winsome. Asked the dragonflies. How many people had already died on this land, and who were they? First, the Yazoo, who fought valiantly, surely, but who could have never been prepared for guns or disease molded into the shape of one. Surely, the Choctaw were next. And then the kidnapped people, the ones who dropped dead from toil, yes, but especially the ones who refused to mule, whose very skin was defiance. They were the ones who looked on from the darkness and occasionally whispered to their children, "How could you?" Samuel thought they meant, "How could you let them?" Isaiah thought, "How could you stay?" Answers weren't forthcoming, and righteousness filled the voids. Samuel raised his head first. He figured that if pain was going to be this day, it might as well be earned. One of the Barely men snatched the chain attached to the shackle around his neck, pulling him backward, but he didn't fall. The three of them moved directly behind him, attaching his chains and therefore Isaiah's chains to the wagon that James had already climbed into. An old rickety thing, that wagon, yes, but James too, in desperate need of repair. Wobbly and dented wheels that made the ride bumpy and unsure, but purposely pulling it more of a chore. A bed so eaten through by who knows what that the ground beneath could be seen through it, making it a dangerous ride for passengers as well. But it had long stopped serving the purpose of lessening burdens. James raised his right hand, and one by one, some of the people moved from one misty spot to the other. Isaiah had stopped counting the number of them, told to cram themselves onto the flat, and focused instead on the distance between them, Samuel and them. Some of them rushed onto it, but Isaiah couldn't exactly tell whose speed was cursed by excitement and whose was blessed by fear. As they stood in the vehicle that threatened to collapse under their weight, none of that mattered. What mattered was the elevation. Holding on to knowledge that the Toubab didn't yet have, they could now look down, and that too was irresistible. Even that tiny bit of height brought about a new perspective that straightened backs and raised chins while arms met hips akimbo. Isaiah accepted this foolishness, for he knew the source was false, but it stuck in Samuel's throat like a bluegill bone and wouldn't dislodge. Chained to the wagon like the animals they knew they weren't, James sitting inside with the whip in hand and a load of people cramped behind him, Samuel and Isaiah were forced to pull. And they would have to drag the wagon around the entire perimeter of Empty, and on a Sunday too. They wondered if this whole show irritated or pleased Amos. They glanced in the direction of people still standing among the grass and fog and spotted Amos there.
Robert, I'm very sorry. I did that accidentally. I'm terribly sorry.
It's
There was
okay.
another microphone open. I
Oh, yes, I
apologize.
heard it. It was distracting, so I thank you.
I apologize.
um, um, they glanced in the direction of the people still standing among the grass and fog and spotted Amos there, a book held under his arm. They took in small pieces of his face and reassembled it inside their heads. Samuel chose irritated, Isaiah pleased. They would never agree, so they took up another project. They eyed empty. This was how they got to know it. Every nook, every crevice, every blasted blade of grass. While Samuel plotted, Isaiah focused on the details. He-yah! James spoke to them in animal language, and to move accordingly would make a lie true. So neither of them budged. The first lash sent a shock through Isaiah, and his vision blurred for a moment before returning with even more clarity. That's when he noticed that they were almost pristine. The lines of empty, how at each point they were marked by something glorious, a flower, a rock, a tree. It might have been tolerable if uninhabited, if simply galloped through rather than owned, with no one around to mind someone stopping to speak to the bee that found its way to the heart of nectar and wish it good passage, and then look up to the clouds and yell, "Me!" Nothing this calm should have such capacity for terror. Isaiah looked down as the tears said, "I'm a-comin'." He saw his feet as they dug into the squishy, slippery ground that gave no traction. The second crack struck Samuel, and Isaiah trembled for him. With everything dead set on betrayal, the young men's hearts pounded a rhythm of distrust. Samuel's more than Isaiah's. It was the strain that had divided them and made them prickly. Samuel glanced at Isaiah and resented him. It swirled in his chest for a moment before being pushed back down into his stomach with deep inhalation. It would only take both of them to wait until the chains were loosed, to snake them around the necks of the burly men and strangle them before succumbing to the gun wounds that would inevitably follow. But he knew Isaiah didn't have that in him to do. Samuel had known Isaiah for all these years and still hadn't gotten to the heart of what made Isaiah not even want to squeeze a fist tightly. What a danger to be so callow. Meanwhile, Isaiah avoided Samuel's glances because they hid nothing. And what use was it to explain to him that a last resort should be last and not first? But still, Isaiah's chest swelled with the strain of understanding that they were bound together by something much stronger than the rusty chains that held them. Tempting, though, was the thought of how much peace, however fleeting, there could be if one boy dared to be remiss in his duty and failed to bring the other boy water. They were not oxen, but they moved, and the people watched. Isaiah would remember to tell Samuel later that he never understood the fascination with blue. Sure, it spotted the land in remarkable ways, broke up monotony, and offered a reprieve from the blinding shock of cotton, but it wasn't special. It was a distraction like everything else, and he was tired of not paying attention. Still, looking upon it in the distance, peeking out of the fog, it seemed as though maybe pieces of sky had broken and fallen to the ground, and perhaps it was right to give that a name. He closed his eyes and made the mistake of getting lost. It was the first time that Isaiah thought about who came before him. Who was Paul's first victim? Was it a girl? A girl was an investment for two Bob men because they could be raped into multiplying, but the rewards of such could take decades to bear fruit. A boy then, with big arms, wide shoulders, a black and heaving chest, and iron legs who can drag a hoe through land, digging the lines of demarcation needed to plant whatever seed the land would take. Did Paul's father give him the boy? Did Paul's father give the boy to him as a gift? First a toy and then a tool? Or was he Paul's first purchase, selected from the auction block after being picked over, prodded, inspected, and finally approved for a life of drudgery? It matters to know who was first because it should be noted who didn't prevent a second. Not that he could be blamed. That was too large for any one person to manage on his own, and death was only heroic after it was done. But fuck the first. Samuel wondered if any of them would be the last, or at least the one who would leave blight in his wake so that no Toubab would ever think to take up the dreadful enterprise again. A well-placed axe or stolen guns, the only difference between them being volume. One had to decide which they preferred, submersion or thunderclap. Right now, Samuel felt like making noise. He wanted to feel the warm metal in his hands, to raise it to one eye and close the other, to wrap his finger around the trigger and pull, to watch his target riddled and bleeding. Let someone else's blood and body nurture the soil for once. How many people had he already seen destroyed, and no one with the decency to cover a child's eyes? As they were both inside of themselves encountering forlorn moments of disgrace, Isaiah and Samuel rounded a bend, which made the wagon clearer in the periphery. The people still stood in it, straight and tall, like pillars of salt that Isaiah didn't want to look back on for fear of becoming one too. Samuel, as always, merely kept his eyes forward because there was no reason to look back or above. There was nobody up there who could help. The past had no other use than to dredge up pain and mystery and thus to confound. And there were already too many things in the present that made no damn sense. So the future was the only possible place where he might find resolution. Isaiah, on the other hand, wondered the shape of the plantation. Was it square or rectangular? He could count the steps, but he wasn't supposed to know how to count that high. It wouldn't be a circle because Toubab seemed to despise those, relentlessly worshipped right angles as though they provided order in and of themselves. It could be a triangle, but that was too unlikely because the angles could never be right. He realized then how much of this he wasn't supposed to know. Shapes, angles, and the differences between them. Mathematics was forbidden because, he convinced himself, there was an equation that would reveal things that neither the Pauls nor the Amoses in the world wanted the Isaiahs to know. They spoke of trees, fruits, and snakes, but that was only a diversion meant to dissuade you from measuring the distance between here and life. But Isaiah went along, feigning ignorance, hurt as much as the lash. It was the pretending that all he was good at was toil and not the chains that threatened to break him. The jangling of the metal hoops that connected his and Samuel's hands and their feet like the letter I, a spike holding each shackle in place, making the walk more difficult because the legs had to be spread to avoid piercing one's own ankle with the other. The Toubab somehow imagined nudity to be degrading, so the walkers were always stripped down before they were forced to drag. Attached like a hind end of a horse so that degradation became the defining characteristic. But to be in one's natural state, save the mosquitoes, wasn't the kind of humiliation Toubabs imagined it to be. The skin caught every breeze along with every light. Privates were free, and the fog kissed you, left the moisture for your skin to drink, every bit as holy as any baptism, perhaps purer because it was voluntary and never purported to be salvation. Walking on nettles was meaningless as feet had become immune because of the calluses. Isaiah, unlike Samuel, had learned to find any tiny pleasure wherever it could be found. So when James purposely steered them over a bush whose thorns were obvious, it had disparate effects. Isaiah smiled when he shouldn't have. Samuel refused to wince when he had to. What pleasure! Samuel, in so many ways, was suspicious of it because he knew how easily it could be taken away. So if he refused to adore it, he wouldn't miss it when it was snatched from him. Hold on. No, that was a lie. There was one pleasure that he enjoyed beyond his ability to control, and were it to be removed from his grasp, he would become as empty as his pried open hands, scraped out down to the shell of himself, a walking nothing, which wouldn't only be regretful for him. The pitchfork they used to gut him would inevitably leave impressions. Those marks would have to show something, and what was shown inevitably becomes what was done. Samuel wouldn't look up, not now, not ever. He would look dead ahead. He could already see the blood coming. And from there, he could see the bend of the world, not that it mattered. All he could do was see it. He was never going to ride it. It might ride him, though, strap its ends on him and kick before it placed him over the stretch of its arc and rolled over him. Here, trudging through this land that surrendered too quickly, Samuel found what most others didn't know. There is a spark at the end of a lash, a tiny speck of light, absent of any color. It's hidden behind the momentary sound of leather meeting flesh. If you blink at all, it will be missed or discarded as trick of an eye. But it's there, certainly, untainted by the blood that has now darkened the whip's tongue, unmoved by the cries of the righteous and wicked alike, making no distinction between the two. It floats above, almost to observe, but like trees, never to witness, and speeds down, not like lightning, but like thunder, and everything shakes. Everything, the past and the future together. And with the present left in such a state of quivering, the mind has no choice but to travel and join. Isaiah looked at Samuel, and the direction of Samuel's eyes led him to the spark too. Even with the tears stinging his eyes, he saw it, most clearly just above the sting that followed, a North Star that led nowhere. Wait, wrong. It led people here, to empty, where they too would become so, capable, perhaps newly, perhaps always, of interrupting true affection and replacing it with something less for reasons that were perfunctory and only sometimes bitter. The bombast, all that frantic posing was designed as a cover for something even more indecent, nature. And the spark mocked them, flaunted how easily it could pierce reality and then retreat as though it had never been there in the first place, failed to leave behind a path from which it could be followed into that other realm. Though there was no guarantee that anything over there would be better, it could be the same or worse, and that could be what the colorlessness signaled. Besides, a beckoning was rarely a reason to rejoice. Still, the mind, in callous circumstances, insisted upon longing for every meager delight. Language undone by the threat of violence, they could only signal and suggest, hoping gesture could be translated, and Samuel didn't mistake tucked lips for fight, or as Isaiah think a balled fist could possibly mean patience. But they had known each other long enough not to fall victim to such easy deceptions. They placed desire above the indisputable for the sake of not wanting to think, which was another way of saying surrender. And they couldn't surrender now, not after all of this, not after they had stunned even themselves at how expertly they were in uniting the entire plantation against them, Toubab and person alike. Shit, look at how even the flowers looked at them. dandelion swaying not in the breeze because there was no breeze except in the motion of Samuel and Isaiah passing them by. The milkweed turned away, but the obedience seemed curious. Dozens of smiles laced on top of one another like treachery. That was what Isaiah smelled as they passed the huddled bushes. Everyone else might have enjoyed the fragrances, but Isaiah knew what it was really. So did Samuel. Isaiah was tempted then to scream, to allow his legs to buckle instead of needlessly resisting. It had become clear that it was the resisting that was most despised. But acquiescence would mean nothing but more drudgery and more abuse for error. To give up now would mean that exhausted knees could crash against pillowy weeds and the chest could collapse in on itself before it hit the ground. Lying there, ass out to all eternity, but able to catch his breath and close his eyes, if just briefly, he would raise a weak smile, but still a smile. This was tiny, but still joy. He hated himself for how much he wanted it, but hated even more the circumstances that made him want it. Samuel wouldn't dare admit that he wanted the same thing, so his hate could never be turned inward. If he closed his eyes, it was only to imagine the creative ways in which that hatred could be acted out. So when his hands and teeth clenched, it wasn't only because of the lash. And just because he was bent didn't mean he couldn't see their faces. He signaled as much when he raised his chin and used his lips to point Isaiah's weary stare in the direction of the crowds of people watching them as they drudged around empty, like two white horses pulling a carriage of royalty. This was not a race, but there they were, huddled together, only some against their will, waiting at the finish line. This was not a race, but it was a race. Why did they have to stand so close? Because most of them wanted to see. They needed to see so that they could be thankful that it wasn't them being broken right before their eyes. At the same time, both Samuel and Isaiah noticed the smiles on the faces of some of them. Maybe not smiles exactly, but if approval could fix the lips to curl a certain way, then this was it. Isaiah noticed something more, a heaviness in their eyelids that spoke nothing of weariness. Their heads were tilted too far back. No, the downcast gazes shouted one word: yes. That was the weight that finally made Isaiah collapse at the ankles. He stumbled forward, landing square in a patch of star creeper. Stretched out like one himself, he cried into them, and Maggie was the first among the crowd to make a move. Her hands trembled and her eyes were alert, but she knew better than to extend a hand. Samuel just panted, and maybe his eyelids got heavy too. Isaiah didn't have to say he surrendered because lying face down, stretched out like a star fool, already said it plainly. It made Samuel angry enough to pick up his disparate pieces and put them back together in glorious order. One final lash for daring, and then Samuel put Isaiah's arm around his neck, and together they walked with labored and wobbly step, chains just a jangling, back toward the barn, bow-legged because of the spikes, but not wanting to be unchained just yet. Twin backs, juicy with the marks left by whips and disapproving gazes. By the time they collapsed into each other, just past the barn entrance, dust scattering as they fell, to the dreary people watching, they looked like two ravens who had the nerve to become one.
Thank you, Robert. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Just beautiful. We have time for some questions from the audience. I'm going to ask you to write stack in chat, and Philip can call on you. He says yes.
Hi, Deshaun. Deshaun Winslow's here too, another Brooklyn College writer. Award-winning, American Book Award-winning Deshaun Charles Winslow. We have so many award-winning writers from Brooklyn College. Brooklyn College is the place for writers to be born.
And grow.
And grow and learn and find themselves.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'll start off. I recently learned about the interviews that were done by members of the Federal Writers Project during the Great Depression. The Federal Writers Project was part of the New Deal, and the writers interviewed people who had been children during before emancipation.
Oh, wow.
And well, you just said, wow. So I guess the answer is no, you didn't know about this. I was going to ask you if you had managed to create these characters because of having read some of these interviews, but the answer is no.
All credit for my understanding of antebellum slavery and the role of the enslaved person and how they managed to survive or not this dreadful period in our history goes to the Department of Africana Studies at Brooklyn College. Between Professor George Cunningham, Prudence Cumberbatch, Linda Day, and so many others, I had the benefit of reading so many wonderful works by some of the most incredible Black luminaries, from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Jacobs, and then more recently, Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, so that I could understand this period from the inside out, and ensure that in writing a book about slavery, I did not make slavery the main character, but that these people upon whom this tragedy was being perpetrated, they are the main characters, and that what's central at this novel is their humanity. And I wanted to make sure that that was given its proper platform. And I thank the Department of Africana Studies for giving me the foundation to be able to do that.
Julia, Agus, you please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Robert, that was really just fantastic to listen to. And I'm not sure quite how to formulate my question, because it's a could you please talk about kind of request. But in listening and thinking about how you move the point of view to that near consciousness Ellen was talking about, and the way you move between landscape and consciousness and narrative time, I guess I want to ask you, how do you do that? And I have a couple, I mean, I'm asking in two ways. How did you think about how to create the sense of time in the novel? But also, what role did reading aloud as you write, if any, play for you in general, but also specific to your understanding of the temporal parameters and quality and temperament you were creating? Because you read really, really beautifully, and to begin with, and but it was just amazing to watch things sharpen and then become more impressionistic and then sharpen and shift in scale. So I'll just turn that over to you.
Thank you, Julie. When I started this novel, maybe in my later drafts, I was working on this with Ernesto Mestre in workshop in the MFA program. And it dawned on me that time moved differently for people who didn't even know their birthdays or how old they were, who counted time based on seasons, perhaps, who counted time based on starting time and quitting time, that time would be a bit more amorphous for people who did not have clocks. So I wanted to make sure that there was a little bit of that nebulous quality to the time when I was writing it, because I wanted their perspective of time to be how time was felt in this book. And so it shifts in these sort of metaphysical ways at times in which they have to sort of relate to their environment to understand where they are and what time it is based on where the sun is or where the moon is. So that is how I kind of formulated that idea. And as far as how I started bringing in the other elements, I did a lot of reading of works from Toni Morrison in particular. I was reading Bluest Eye and Beloved and Song of Solomon and Tar Baby and A Mercy to get this kind of understanding about the natural world as she understood it in these times and places, and in ways in which I could then replicate and sort of develop worlds that felt lush and beautiful, because I could not judge the environment. I couldn't say, because this was a plantation, it must have been ugly, because the opposite was actually true. The world was so beautiful as these horrible things were happening. And so I had to sort of reconcile, how do I have this horror alongside something that's so lush and gorgeous? And the Prophets is my attempt at sort of trying to meld that in a way that the reader gets to see, this is horrible, but look at how beautiful this world in which this horrors are happening, which is usually the case. We often think of horror, we attach it to, ugliness, but sometimes the horror and the beauty are the same thing.
There's a question in the chat from Toma, and I'm willing to read it. On the other hand, please do unmute yourself if you'd care to. I will take the opportunity to read it then. It says, thank you for reading this passage, Robert. I wrote down the beginning of the chapter when I first read Babel, was taken with the description of trees and their roles as witnesses, alive yet silent. Mentions of trees and other inanimate characters reemerge throughout the novel, and I'm curious to know what we can learn from these characters.
That's very interesting. Trees for me hold that space that I was just talking about with Julie, of horror and beauty at the same time, because these trees, lush and beautiful and green and giving us nourishment with their fruits and beauty with their flowers and so on and so forth, are also the trees from which my ancestors were hung or hanged. So there is this sort of thing when you look at a tree, and when we cut down the tree, we see in the middle its rings, because we can tell how old they are. And science is now starting to say that trees can maybe feel, and that they hold on to things, maybe like memory. They have some sort of sense of what's happening around them. And so from that, I thought about, well, what have these 100-year-old trees and hundreds of years old, what have they witnessed? And what can they tell us if they were able to tell us? And then I started to think about that with all other manner of species, whether it be horses or pigs or insects or roosters, about how they perceive what they see us as these human beings, the dominant species on the planet, doing. And do they judge us? And so are they afraid of us? And so I kind of wanted to incorporate some of the natural world in that way, in that perspective, into the Prophets.
Thank you. Wendy Ferry has a question.
Oh, Wendy.
Hi, Robert.
Hi.
Thank you for your beautiful book.
Thank you.
I have a question. I remember when you were my student, I had students write weekly response papers, and you wrote one in which you made tangible to me something that was missing in my life at the time, which was the sense of touch, physical intimacy and emotional intimacy with another person. And I think one of the most powerful elements in your book is this sense of touch between people. It's either, beautiful and loving and breathtaking, or ugly, like when Ruth comes in and tries to have sex with, which one is it, Samuel or Isaiah? Samuel. Just your, and I wondered if how you developed that in your writing, what it comes from, and are you conscious of that strength in your work?
I am very conscious of that. And you can speak to President Anderson about this. This world, because of rape culture, has really corrupted touch. It has made touch such a frightening endeavor that you are afraid of. We now have to ask our children, do you want to give permission for your aunt to hug you? That is where we are now, because we have did a disservice to women and children and other survivors. So I wanted to create a world in which consensual touch return and is restored to its former glory, stripped away from the ways in which we have utterly corrupted it and made it a frightening thing, where touch is always associated with harm. I wanted to create a safe space, particularly for Samuel and Isaiah, but also for the other characters, in which touch becomes the safe space, as opposed to the space where you have to now be suspicious of the person touching you because you don't know their intentions. So it was a very conscious effort to make sure that everything associated with love in this book, particularly when expressed through touch, was mostly, when it was consensual, given as much beauty as I could possibly write into it.
Thank you.
Jamila Simmons. Are you with us?
Hi, Robert Jones.
Hi, Jamila.
I'm so excited to see you, Robert.
Pleasure.
Much love. I'm curious, because I had so many water cooler conversations with you about modern LGBTQ issues. How much of that factored into your being able to put yourself in the shoes of these characters from such a long time ago? But then also, if you could talk about the amount of research that went into putting yourself in the shoes of people who lived in these same Black and LGBTQ shoes so many years ago.
Sure, that's a great question. One of the things that I encountered when I was writing the book were people who were saying, but there were no Black queer people then. And that caused me to look in the canon to see if I could find any examples of it. Because what we tend to do is say, that could not have existed because we did not give it language. As though queerness popped up the moment we said, that's queer. Suddenly the person becomes queer because we named it. When in actuality, queerness has been a part of the human landscape for as long as there have been human beings. It may not have distinguished itself necessarily as a distinct identity. And of course, it did not have a name, although pretty early on, early Christians called it sodomy, or called people who engaged in same-sex behavior sodomites, and called the women of the Greek island of Lesbos lesbians. But these people existed. And where I found that most of all was in the oral history of indigenous African peoples. I did a tremendous amount of research about pre-colonial African societies and how they viewed things like gender and gender identity and sexuality, and found, surprisingly, that Western ideas about these things are not universal. They are constructions. Because, for example, Esther Arma, who is a brilliant artist activist from Ghana, said if you had asked her great-grandparents, what is a homosexual? They would say, I don't know, we don't have that. And we would come away then thinking, oh, there were no homosexuals in Ghana. She said, you would have been mistaken, because you should have asked, you should have explained to them what you meant by homosexual, and then they would have said, oh, you mean love. Because for them, there was no need to distinguish heterosexuality from homosexuality, from cisgender and transgender. It was all part of the landscape, and how her tribe in Ghana viewed those sorts of things was love was like land. There were no boundaries. And so it had always been part of the landscape. It was just never something that was viewed as separate or different or sinful or depraved. And so we mistakenly believed that it then did not exist. But once I discovered that, it opened up a tremendous world for me to be able to explore this with much more confidence than I was initially, thinking that was there any truth to this idea that there were no Black queer people during antebellum slavery?
Professor Florence?
I think you're muted, Namalunda.
Unmute Namalinda.
I'll try to find her.
You'd think I'd have known that by now, but no. Nah. My apologies. So I pour out my congratulations and you didn't hear any of it. But thank you again and again. So I'm interested in shifting locations. I think of you writing this book and steeped in a world of egregious dehumanization, what humans can do to others. How do you move from there to the world as we know it now, or looking at this gallery here of white, Black faces and in-betweens? How do you move from one to the other, or even move not just from that book, but to the real life of, let's say their names, let's talk about Breonna, let's talk about George Floyd. How do you manage to stay sane?
Oh, that is a really good question, because what I found in writing this book was the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, for example, we are no longer toiling on cotton plantations, but we do now have the prison industrial complex that gobbles up Black bodies in the exact same way. We are no longer being whipped by plantation owners and overseers, but we are being killed in broad daylight on camera by police officers who do so without remorse. So racism, among other bigotries, has this amazing ability to shapeshift such that it meets the mores of whatever epoch it's in. And that was one of the things that was revealed to me when I was writing this book, so that when I'm talking about Maggie and Sarah and Pua and B Auntie, I see them as the forebears of Ayanna Stanley Jones and Breonna Taylor and others who are struck down. They were like, the violence has never ended. It is simply transformed into different, it's taken a different shape. It's cast itself under a different veneer. But it has always remained to some degree legal. And I say that because when we see these police officers on camera killing unarmed Black people, they face no consequences. So it might as well be legal as it was for slave masters to rape Black women and then not call it rape. It is the exact same thing. And part of the issue with this country, part of the American pathology, is the refusal to face one's demons. We always talk about moving forward without having healed the thing we're trying to move forward from. Thus, we never actually move forward. We stand in the same place. And how I survive this, delving into this sort of work and facing these traumas that our ancestors endured so that we might be here, is I take long walks. I walked from my house in Bedford-Stuyvesant to Queens and back. I love to go to the park or the botanical gardens up in the Bronx. I spent a lot of time with my nieces, nephews, and nibblings. Nibblings is the non-gender, the non-binary name for your sibling's child, because children's laughter is a healing thing. And I just meditated a great deal too, to help pull myself out of those spaces. But also, I felt like my ancestors actually endured this. The least that I can do, no matter how painful it might feel for me, is witness it and share their testimony. So that's what actually kept me going, is I could at least say that I was not enduring this directly, and I could pay homage to their sacrifices and struggles by telling their story.
Thank you, my brother.
Thank you.
President Anderson?
Hi, Robert. We are so excited to have you here and so deeply proud of you and moved by your work and just honored to have you return. This is such an incredible homecoming for all of us, seeing you come back in this way with such accolades for you and for your work. You know, the comparisons that were mentioned at the beginning, that you know, your eyes are rolling, but we feel it. We read and we feel it, we see it. And I wanted to ask you, so I just want to thank you for being here first and really express how honored we are to see you and to have you back. A lot of reviews of the novel talk about the fact that there is no, or a problem, a challenge that you faced is there is no narrative of queerness in the life of enslaved people. And I wonder how you thought about history and a lack of history, kind of a vacuum with these stories and trying to fill it. And what is the relationship between history when there is a history and you're writing a story about it, and when there's not a history, or there aren't historical facts that you can hold on to, and so you're shaping it in the way that you do?
That was really one of the most daunting tasks in crafting this work. Was I don't have a template. I have to imagine into existence what it must have been like if you were exposed as a Black person who was in a same-sex loving relationship during this time when there was nothing in the canon that talked about this. What's wonderful, though, is most recently, it was uncovered that the very first drag queen in America was a gentleman by the name of William Dorsey, who was a formerly enslaved man. That information just came out in the last year or so. So when I was writing this book, I started to feel like people are gonna not think that this is feasible. They're gonna think this is far-fetched, that this is me attempting to insert some sort of quote unquote gay agenda into history. But the fact of the matter is, when we look at history, we often look at it through a heterosexist lens, in which we think that heterosexuals are the dominant and the only perspectives that matter. And that I can imagine that there are countless stories of queer people during this time period that have never made the record because either they were terrified to share their lives or because those stories were intentionally erased. So what I had to do was I just had to read as much as I possibly could, think about myself as a Black queer person in modern times, and try to sort of time travel and project my spirit back to those times to sort of think about, well, what would what would other enslaved people have thought about two enslaved men who were in love? Would they have seen it as disgusting, or would they have to be prompted to see it that way based on whatever philosophies they were being indoctrinated with? And all of the evidence that I could find showed that it was with the coming of European colonization and Christian missionary work to the continent of Africa that made people who normally saw same-sex relationships as normal to see them then as sinful or ungodly. And so that sort of helped give me a bit of a foundation from which to imagine characters like Samuel and Isaiah and Sarah and others who are engaged in what we would think of as non-traditional relationships.
I believe Ms. Simmons would like to ask another question.
So Robert, you touched on this with your last answer and even a little bit the one before that, but I wondered if you could talk more about whether along the way or since the book has been published, whether you got any pushback about this idea of queer love during the days of slavery and how much it existed and how valid it was. But after you answer that, I'm sorry, I don't see down the chat, but I've got questions. So answer that first. And if there's time, I'll go ahead.
And I also see a question from Dale Byam. Hi, Professor Byam, because I want to answer her question too. But so far, I have not received any pushback on the idea of Blackness and queerness during this time. Most people are saying that it's written in a way that makes it seem like, oh yeah, of course, why didn't we think of it that way? But I do anticipate that at some point, given what social media is, that certain people are going to come across this work and then start to attribute it to me trying to promote some sort of gay agenda, to emasculate the Black man, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for which I'm ready for those sorts of things because I'm backed up by tons and tons of research about what, where queerness falls in the human family. So not yet, but I'm anticipating it. And to Dale Byam's question, she asked, have you read the works of Danye R. Love? Yes, I have. Danye R. Love is a playwright and a friend of mine who, while I was writing The Prophets, his play Sugar in Our Wounds came out, which is about two enslaved men in love. And when that came out, I thought to myself, darn it, he got the idea out there first. I should just stop writing. But my husband said, no. There are many stories to tell from that time period. You continue to tell your story. And so I did, but shout out to Danye because he was the first to broach the subject in art with his play, Sugar in Our Wounds.
Professor Natov?
You're muted.
Sorry. Rob, hugs.
Intake of breath.
Intake of breath. First, I want to say that your portrait of Isaiah and Samuel as lovers grew naturally out of their relationship as children. And that naturalness was really very beautiful and rarely shown that way. And I have a question, the Bible, all those, wow. So can you tell me what the Bible was doing? I was doing a lot of things, but.
I knew that when I wrote this book, while I was writing this book, I kept running into this central conflict, which was that the thing that makes people turn against the idea of what we now call queerness is, in this context, Christian indoctrination. It is what made we as Black people decide that our African spiritualities and spiritual points of view were somehow now demon work and evil and ugly, and that we needed to turn to what was essentially a white Christ to be saved, and to find salvation. And it also removed us from our own cultural practices and the things that we saw as part of the natural landscape. So I wanted to represent, in the book, how am I going to sort of talk about that both on a metaphorical level and also as a plot point. And one of the things that came to me was that naming was a big deal, and how Africans who were enslaved were stripped of their names and renamed in order to make them subservient, and to subjugate them. And I thought that leads me to this idea of maybe the characters in this book should all have this name that is something attached to Christianity, because mostly enslaved people were given Christian names. And then from that idea, I started to think, and each of these characters with a Christian name is telling us a story. Some of it is a warning, almost like how prophets gave us these warnings in the Bible. And then I started to match up characters with their counterparts in the Bible. So for example, Maggie is sort of my take on Mary Magdalene. And I thought, oh, maybe this book should be called The Prophets, because I am in some ways reworking a religious narrative, and trying to provide a different way of looking at spirituality such that all of us are included and that there is no exclusion. If we are going to say that Christianity is a religion of love, then let me try to show what I think love actually is by rewriting it in this particular way.
Professor Tremper?
I have to call attention to time, although I don't want to, because this is wonderful. We can go on for a bit, but I want to say to the people in the MFA program whose workshop should have started at 6:30, that if they're still here, they can certainly leave at this point. But if there are more questions, we can take a few more.
Professor Hashmi had a question earlier in the chat, and I wondered if she'd be willing to read it or would like me to do so.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I just want to say that my class, Gender, Sexuality, and the Media, are here listening to you, and you very graciously talked to them a few years ago. So thank you so much for that and for this.
Thank you.
I was wondering, and I know this stuff taking a bit away from the book itself. There's so much talk about there, but you know, Son of Baldwin is so amazing. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about your the relationship between those two kinds of writing and thinking, and especially since the community around Son of Baldwin was so important. And how do you see fiction creating a community of a different kind, perhaps, or do you see any overlaps or connections? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Mobina. It's good to see you, by the way. I started Son of Baldwin. Again, this is a Brooklyn College kind of inspiring me to do something. I came to James Baldwin very late in my life. I'm a returning student. I came back to college at the age of 31. And one of the first core classes I took, I have to shout out the core curriculum, cores 1 through 10. That was like one of the best systems I have ever encountered in life. It made me such a well-rounded student. And I was taking People, Power, and Politics. And it was with Jeremy Crace, was my professor. And shout out to Professor Crace. And he assigned us an essay by James Baldwin called Here Be Dragons. And I was so enamored by this essay, and knew nothing about James Baldwin, surprisingly. I didn't even know he was Black. And I went to the library and started taking out all of his books and learned that he was not just Black, but he was queer, he was a man raised in New York City, and he was a writer. All of the things that I was or wanted to be. And I immediately adopted him as my spiritual godfather. And I said, this was in like 2002, and Baldwin had not had the renaissance that he's experiencing in the last 5 or 10 years or so. And I was wondering why he wasn't a bigger part of the cultural zeitgeist. And in about 2007, I said, I'm going to make sure that he's part of this, after watching a documentary in which his brother said some of his last words were, "I hope that people find me in the wreckage." And that hit me like a thunderbolt, because I thought he thought maybe he would be lost to time. And so I started Son of Baldwin as a tribute to him, to discuss his work, as well as all the issues he brought to light, such as sexuality and gender and race and whiteness and politics and all of that. And in 2009, moved it to Facebook, and that's where it started to sort of gain traction, because at first I had it on Blogspot. And it has been a really long time of learning. It has been such a wonderful learning experience to be engaged in that community of people all over the world telling me their experiences as Black women, as Black cisgender women, as Black transgender women, as Black gay men, as living in Zimbabwe and Brazil and Toronto, all over the world, that it opened my mind up so tremendously, such that it was an expansion of my own education as an American, because we tend to be so American-centric in the ways we interpret the world, and think that our way is the best way or the only way. And you start to learn and see so many different perspectives, and come to conclusions that you think, well, maybe this way, our way, isn't the best way. Maybe there are other ways of thinking about life and solving some of the greatest problems that face us. How Son of Baldwin informs my political writing when I'm writing nonfiction. First of all, James Baldwin is always the little person sitting on my shoulder when I'm writing nonfiction, telling me you're not going deep enough, or no, you're off track here. And as you can see, he's right here sitting on my shoulder with my nonfiction. Toni Morrison is the one who sits on my shoulder for my fiction. But it has really just broadened my political thinking, particularly when it relates to feminism. Because yes, I'm Black and queer, and those are my marginalized identities, but I am also a man. I'm also cisgender. I'm also educated, live in America, employed, all of the other ways in which I am privileged. And people like Kimberlé Crenshaw helped me to understand the intersectionalities and the different ways in which I, as a human being, am perceived, and how I interpret this world, and the many other perspectives that I have to take into consideration if I'm going to speak publicly, and to ensure that I am not perpetuating harm. And I think that is the greatest gift of Son of Baldwin, is that they don't waste a moment to drag me across the internet if I have said something off key or wrong. So it has been a blessing. It's been challenging as well, because it's not easy to be put on the spotlight and to be held to a particular standard all the time, or 100% of the day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because you are human and you're going to make errors and mistakes. But it is a place where I have found untold knowledge. And I don't get to understand the impact that Son of Baldwin has had, because I don't engage with people outside of Son of Baldwin. But the few times that people have reached out to me to tell me They say that they learned so much from that space. So I'm just really thankful that it is operating as a force of, I hope, good in the world.
Very much so. Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a conversation taking place in the chat, but I don't see questions identified as such. Are there other folks who would like to speak or ask a question? Oh, here is one. I'm sorry, I just now see it. Which character was the hardest to write? Why?
The most difficult character to write was Paul, the plantation owner. And the reason why that character was so difficult to write is because as a writer, I cannot hate any of the characters I'm writing about. I don't necessarily have to love them, but I cannot hate them because I have to give them their due. I have to afford them their humanity. And I had to afford the humanity to even Paul. And that really felt like a betrayal to my ancestors. And so it was difficult for me. I had to really sit down, meditate, converse with this character about why he would do the things that he did. So I had to allow him to give his testimony too, about why he's the type of person he is, why he would think that it was okay to own slaves, and what in his life might have led him to that sort of thinking. So I had to sympathize with him. And that was really hard because I am a Black person and I don't want to sympathize with people who tortured my ancestors. It is difficult and it's hard, and it brings about a great deal of conflict. But if I'm going to engage in this craft, then I have to go to places that aren't always comfortable. And that was one. Paul was the hardest character to write. He's also the character that probably has the longest chapter. And that is probably a function of me trying to understand him so that the readers could understand him as well.
Now I believe that Jamila would like to ask her follow-up.
Sorry for being so stingy here, Robert.
Oh, it's fine.
I'd love to know what's next for you, Robert. What are you at all worried about being pigeonholed as the Black gay writer? You know, or what kind of topics are you thinking about? And then, if I could selfishly piggyback another question, which I reached out to you about in general, but curious, you know, I mentioned that my son and his second grade class are looking at, for Black History Month, the intersectionalities of Black and LGBTQ identities. And I realized, as much as I'd like to think of myself as an ally, I don't really have the language, at least that I think I don't have the language to really kind of delve deeply into these issues to explain some of these topics to him. And so I'd love to hear that you're thinking about, you know, a younger or kids book around these topics. But again, in general, I'm curious, what's next?
What's next? So The Prophets is being optioned as a film or TV limited series. So that's one thing with The Prophets. And for me, I have to be able to get out of Prophets mode before I can return to what's next. And what is next, or what will be next, is another novel. Right before I sold The Prophets to my publisher, I was working on a second novel that I got about 40 pages into. And I am not at all afraid to be pigeonholed as the Black queer writer. I wear both of those identities with pride. And I think that they open up for me such unproven ground. Like it's all brand new territory for me to explore in that intersection. And I know that all of my novels will be from the perspective of the Black queer lens, always. So I am not at all terrified of being pigeonholed in that way. I find being thought of as the Black queer writer a compliment. And then in terms of a children's book, I probably will not ever write a children's book, but there is a Black queer writer by the name of George M. Johnson, who writes young adult and children's literature, in which maybe it makes it a little bit easier for them to grasp these concepts.
Robert, I remember, I'm not muted. I remember Michael Cunningham's talking about having written a novel called Flesh and Blood, which had mostly straight characters in it. And he thought of it as his breakthrough novel. It turned out not to be, The Hours was, but you have already broken through, so you can do whatever the hell you want. We'll take one more question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up. But before we do, I want to encourage those of you who haven't already bought Robert's book and started reading it to go to the link, Greenlight's bookstore, and order your copy. And I want to give you my great thanks in having come here tonight, having written this novel.
Thank you.
So one more question and we will say goodbye.
Well, I do find one question in the chat, and it's about your writing process. If there are unique details that work for you in the process of writing.
My writing process. Okay, so in undergrad, I worked 3 part-time jobs, one of which I worked for Ronnie Natov in the English counseling office. In grad school, I worked 2 part-time jobs. And then when I graduated from the MFA program, I had a full-time job. And so it's always daunting for a writer to find the time to actually write for their own projects, because I worked in Brooklyn College's Office of Communications and Marketing. So I was writing for Brooklyn College, but I was hard pressed to find time to write for my own creative edification. So this is what I did. As Toni Morrison put it, I wrote at the edges of the day. I would get up at the magic hour, the witching hour, 3 a.m., sit in front of the computer, write for an hour, go to bed at 4 o'clock, wake up at 6 to get ready to go to work.
Oh my.
And I did that every night. And the nights that I didn't do it, I felt extremely guilty because I felt like I'm not committed to this process if I'm not demanding this from myself. And it's sometimes you don't feel like getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning because you're exhausted. And I would also write on my commute to and from work. So on the B44, going to Brooklyn College and coming back, or in the A train, going to the city and coming back. I wrote whenever life did not interrupt. And I found the best time to write was at the witching hour because the world was so silent that I could hear all of the voices that I needed to hear. I had, it was like I was the only person in the world at that time. And so it gave me the silence that I needed to write and also gave me the courage, because if you're alone, you're not worried about how it's going to be received, the critical eye, your inner opponent telling you, oh, you're not a good writer. All of that falls by the wayside, and you find this quiet space in which to write. And that was where I found it.
Professor Tremper, must we close?
Just finishing my my comment on Robert's hearing his characters being translated in the sentence through interiority and free and direct. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Ellen, one comment.
One more comment?
Please, please, thank you very much for giving me the minute. Robert, I can't let you go. In retrospect, I mean, you're now not in BC, but looking back, what would you say to the rest of us to help build, community over and above this, historical rhetoric we all stepped in?
Oh,
Because you've been here.
yes. The thing, how can I say this? Brooklyn College, like the rest of the country, has to reckon with its past behavior and its present behavior in a way that is honest, in a way that isn't afraid to implicate itself as the problem. Because innocence is the crime, is what James Baldwin would say. When we seek innocence, that cuts us off from being able to actually confront and deal with the problems that we're facing. So if we're innocent, that we're saying that has nothing to do with me, when it absolutely does. Each and every one of us are implicated. And to have these real, deep, honest conversations in which people in power have to be willing to share it, and in some cases give it up, so that all of us can be at the table equally as human beings, and we could say to each other, baseline, I may not agree with everything you say, but you are a human being and I respect you because you exist, period. And so all American institutions, all institutions in the world have to be able to confront the main problems as they are articulated, and Brooklyn College is a community of scholars, so there's no problem with articulating problems, and then be willing to do the work to resolve them in a way that is not disingenuous and not superficial, that is actually structural, and is also, but also symbolic, so that the people from the outside looking in can immediately see the change as it happens.
Mhm.
That is my advice. Confront it.
Here,
That is
here.
a very, very good note on which to end. You have asked us to be reflective, and for that, I thank you. I am going to end this meeting. I want everybody to give Robert the hand that he deserves.
Oh, I just saw Irva Adams. Hi, Irva.
Thank you.
Professor Day, hi.
Hi, Robert.
Thank you so much for having me, Ellen. I'm always pressured to call you Professor Tremper because that's what I've called you for so many years, and you told me, I'm Ellen to you now. So I am saying thank you, Ellen, for inviting me back to my college home. Thank you to President Anderson, to the entire English department, the Wolf, the history department, everyone involved in bringing this together, to women's studies, to Africana studies, all the departments that I think are crucial in ensuring that we are creating right-minded citizens. Thank you so much for being committed to the education of affordable education for students in this city.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night.